story begins with a young boy engrossed in reading an ancient book. Within its worn pages lies a mysterious tale of demons and mages. The scene then shifts to the kingdom of Eljon, where a kind-hearted witch named Rumia waits patiently for her best friend. With the gentle touch of her healing magic, she treats a man with an injured hand. Grateful, the man thanks her, but Rumia, wearing a serious expression, warns him not to tell anyone, for using magic outside the academy is strictly forbidden. Not long after, her cheerful friend Sistine arrives, and together they head toward the academy. On the way, Sistine excitedly shares the news that a new teacher will be joining them today. Suddenly, a young man sprints toward them from the opposite direction, nearly colliding with them. Reacting instinctively, Sistine casts a gust of wind that sends the man tumbling into a fountain. Soaked, he climbs out in irritation, scolding them for their carelessness. Rumia quickly admonishes Sistine, urging her to apologize for using magic against a normal person. However, the man's rude attitude only fuels Sistine's anger, and once again she conjures a blast of wind that knocks him back into the fountain. Fuming, Sistine grabs Rumia by the arm and storms off, leaving the poor man behind. Meanwhile, in the academy office, Headmaster Hallie discusses the situation with another instructor. Hallie complains that the substitute teacher promised to them has already arrived late on his first day. Still, Hallie admits that the teacher was personally recommended by Professor Celica, leaving them with no choice but to wait. Inside the classroom, Rumia and Sistine sit impatiently, having waited for more than 30 minutes. Sistine is visibly annoyed, feeling her time has been wasted. Finally, the classroom door opens, and the young man from before enters. With an air of confidence, he introduces himself as Glenn, their substitute and new instructor. Sistine, already fed up, snaps at him to stop the pleasantries and start the lesson. Elsewhere, a discussion arises about Glenn's background. It is revealed that he is merely a third-rate mage with mediocre skill in every field of magic. Hearing this, Hallie immediately rejects the idea, claiming such a teacher is unfit to train gifted students. He'll probably just tell them to study on their own, Hallie scoffs, and indeed, that's exactly what happens. Glenn writes, "self-study" in large letters on the board, leaving the entire class stunned. Instead of teaching earnestly, Glenn lazily strolls around and prepares to take a nap. Watching this, Sistine's patience snaps. Enraged, she grabs a book and hurls it at him. Meanwhile, the Academy's head explains to Hallie that Glenn truly lacks a teaching license, but his recommendation came from a highly respected professor. Hallie's still dissatisfied and becomes even more curious upon hearing Glenn's past. He entered the academy at age 11, left at 15, and mysteriously disappeared for 4 years. And during those 4 years, what exactly was he doing? Hallie wonders aloud. The headmaster can only admit, "That I do not know." Days pass, and Glenn continues to stand before his class, though his teaching methods leave the students completely puzzled. His handwriting is messy, making it nearly impossible for Sistine to read his notes. When a student asks about a spell translation, Glenn casually gives a vague answer, further irritating Sistine. Losing her composure, she demands a proper explanation, but Glenn calmly replies that he has no idea. Furious, Sistine shouts that he should just quit being a teacher. Glenn only shrugs, telling her to check the dictionary herself, just as the school bell rings. As the students change clothes in the locker room, Sistine vented her frustration, muttering angrily about how awful Glenn was as a teacher. Suddenly, the door swung open, and Glenn himself entered. The entire room froze in shock. Flustered, Glenn stammered an apology, claiming he had entered by mistake. But for Sistine, this was the final straw. Along with her classmates, she dragged him out of the room and beat him till he collapsed. Yet, deep within her heart, Sistine still held on to a promise she had once made to her grandfather, to reach the Sky Castle someday, no matter what obstacles stood in her way. Later that day, Glenn strolled casually into the dining hall, immediately irritating Sistine the moment she saw him. She chose to ignore him and focused on her meal. Sitting beside her, Rumia curiously asked if Glenn always ate with such enthusiasm. Glenn simply smiled, replying that eating was one of life's greatest pleasures. Each bite made him feel more alive. With a tearful grin, he offered some of his food to Rumia, who shyly accepted and tasted it. The flavor was unexpectedly delicious, bringing a genuine smile to her face. Glyn then turned to Sistine and asked why she was eating so little. In a mocking tone, Sistine retorted that she needed to sleep in his next class, so there was no reason to eat much. Realizing her sarcasm, Glyn told her to just say what she meant. Before she could reply, he carelessly pushed a spoonful of food into her mouth. Sistine froze, her face turning red with a mix of anger and embarrassment, before furiously declaring that Glyn was unfit to be called a teacher. Glyn only shrugged, saying he was merely a temporary instructor. A flashback revealed the truth behind his position. Professor Salika had once asked Glyn to take the substitute job, but he had flatly refused. Only after Salika grew serious and even used magic to pressure him did Glyn reluctantly agree, despite clearly having no desire to teach. His true nature quickly resurfaced. In class, he continued to let his students study on their own while he slept at his desk. This infuriated Sistine even more. Consumed by anger, she tore off her gloves and slapped Glyn across the face in front of everyone, challenging him to a duel. The entire class gasped while Rumia desperately tried to stop her impulsive friend. But Sistine boldly declared that if Glyn lost, he must take his job seriously and teach properly. Glyn responded with a faint, confident smile, adding his own condition. If he won, Sistine would have to obey him completely. Thus began a tension-filled showdown, not just a simple duel, but a battle of pride in the future of their magical academy. In the arena, whispers spread rapidly among the gathered students. Sistine nodded, firmly, accepting the terms. With a smirk of confidence, Glyn raised her glove, signaling his agreement to the duel. The two stepped into the center of the field as excited murmurs filled the air. Some students whispered, "If that teacher's really strong, Glyn's going to win, for sure." Before the fight began, Glyn announced one important rule. They could only use the shock bolt spell, no other magic allowed. Sistine agreed without hesitation. The duel commenced with a flash of lightning. Without warning, Sistine unleashed a powerful shock bolt directly at Glyn. The blast struck him squarely, sending him crashing to the ground. The entire audience was left speechless. No one had expected a teacher to look so utterly weak. Glyn stood up, brushing the dust from his clothes with a crooked grin. He remarked that Sistine's attack was impressive, though he claimed he hadn't been ready. Attempting a counterattack, he was immediately struck down again by another shock bolt. Over and over he tried, and over he fell. Eventually, overwhelmed by embarrassment, he made a flimsy excuse and fled the arena. Sistine and the rest of the class could only stare in disbelief, unable to comprehend how their teacher could be so pathetic. The next day, Glyn returned to class not to teach, but to once again tell the students to study on their own. Still irritated from the previous duel, Sistine was caught off guard when Glyn suddenly asked her what made magic truly valuable. Calmly and confidently, Sistine explained that magic was a noble power, a gift that connected them to their origins and helped them better understand the world. She added that just like medical studies, magic could save lives and bring great benefit to humanity. But Glyn's expression darkened. With a faint smirk, he replied in a cold tone, suggesting that magic was far more effective as a weapon. One bullet could kill a single person, but with magic, one could annihilate dozens in an instant. So isn't that, he's whispered, the only real purpose of magic? His words struck Sistine like a blow. Her heart pounded with fury, her face flushed red, and with trembling hands, she slapped Glyn hard across the face. Without uttering another word, she turned and walked away, leaving Glyn and the rest of the class frozen in stunned silence. Later, on the academy rooftop, Glyn sat alone, gazing into the distance. His mind was heavy with thoughts of quitting. He considered visiting Salika to persuade her to release him from the position, but on his way, he stopped upon noticing Rumia in one of the classrooms, tracing patterns of light in the air. Curious, Glyn stepped in and asked why she was still there, reminding her that lab hours had already ended. With a shy smile, Rumia explained that she had been trying to form a magic circle, but no matter how hard she tried, it wouldn't activate. Glyn poured a mysterious liquid over the circle and told her to try again. Instantly, the room filled with a radiant glow as the magic circle came to life. Rumia's face brightened with awe and joy. Glyn stared quietly, momentarily lost in memories of a time when he too once loved magic with that same pure passion. When Rumia asked if he had ever enjoyed his life as a mage, Glyn only smiled faintly and replied that magic had always been dull to him. He refused to elaborate further, as though his past was a wound best left unopened. Curious, Rumia asked why she loved magic so much. With bright eyes, she explained that she wanted to use magic to help others. 3 years earlier, a mage had saved her life, and since that day, she had vowed to follow in those footsteps. Her sincerity made Glenn pause, and a flicker of an old memory crossed his mind, though he kept it to himself. As he turned to leave, Rumia spoke softly but firmly of her dream, to one day master magic and reach the Sky Castle. Elsewhere, Sistine gazed at the sky, her eyes fixed on the distant Sky Castle floating among the clouds. Memories of the past returned, of the promise she once made to her grandfather, vowing that one day she would reach that castle. But not long after that promise, her grandfather passed away, leaving her with only determination and the dream they once shared. The next morning, the entire class was stunned when Glenn openly apologized to Sistine. To everyone's greater surprise, he also confessed that he didn't like magic at all. The students burst into laughter, mocking him. One even sneered, claiming their teacher couldn't even perform a simple shockwave. But instead of getting angry, Glenn stood calmly before them and began to explain the principles of magic. His words carried unexpected depth and insight, silencing the room. From the man once thought lazy and indifferent, a new light began to shine. The students watched in awe as Glenn demonstrated that magic could be used in ways they had never imagined. With his relaxed attitude, he emphasized that true mastery of magic came from listening to one's heart and mind. Suddenly, he stepped closer to Sistine and declared loudly that he loved her. The class gasped in shock. Glenn quickly clarified that it was merely an example, proof that certain words could trigger emotional and mental responses strong enough to produce magical reactions. True enough, Sistine's face flushed red, and Glenn used her reaction as a demonstration. Mortified and furious, Sistine grabbed a book and hurled it straight at him. Glenn ducked and quickly reminded his students not to copy such behavior, adding jokingly that from now on, they wouldn't need to rely so heavily on textbooks. Meanwhile, Celica and the headmaster watched from afar, smiling proudly as they saw Glenn finally teaching with genuine passion. His popularity soared, his once empty classroom now filled with eager students who admired his easy-to-understand lessons and meaningful insights. Yet watching this transformation, Professor Halley's jealousy and resentment only deepened. As night fell, Glenn climbed the academy rooftop, lost in thought about his new life as a teacher. Celica appeared quietly beside him, her expression soft as she told him how happy she was to see him guiding students with sincerity. Not long after, Rumia and Sistine joined them, curious to ask about the nature of Glenn's magic. But instead of answering seriously, Glenn teased Sistine, earning another glare from her again. Still, as the conversation continued, both girls demonstrated their growing understanding of magic. Rumia smiled warmly at Sistine and said that Glenn was in truth a great teacher, and that someday Sistine would come to realize it herself. Yet, behind the calm night and the laughter on the rooftop, two shadowy figures whispered in secret. They were members of the Divine Wisdom, plotting to attack the academy. The following morning, Glenn ran late for class. He sprinted down the road toward the spool, but unease filled his heart. A chilling premonition hung in the air, as if something terrible was about to begin. Inside the classroom, a mysterious man appeared and arrogantly challenged Glenn, claiming that even a mere third-rate mage like him should be able to sense his power. Moments later, two other strangers entered, announcing that Glenn would not be coming to class that day and that they were the new substitutes. The students fell silent, though Sistine's sharp gaze fixed on them with suspicion. She didn't believe a single word they said. Suddenly, the atmosphere turned tense and heavy. Another man stepped forward, his voice cold as he declared that outsiders were not allowed within the academy. Before anyone could react, he unleashed a powerful shockweb spell that crackled through the air with blinding light. The sheer force of it left everyone stunned. This wasn't ordinary magic, it was a spell of military-grade power. The intruder then mentioned Rumia's name and demanded to know where she was. Before he could attack, Sistine bravely stepped forward, claiming to be Rumia in an attempt to protect her. But Rumia stopped her and boldly declared that she was the real one. Sistine froze, unable to understand why Rumia would reveal herself. With calm resolve, Rumia explained her reason, but the man's next words shattered everyone. He announced that their teacher had already been killed by his own hand. The class fell into shock and despair.
One of the men grabbed Rumia, saying she was supposed to be dead, as orders had been given to eliminate the princess. At the same time, another intruder tried to seize Sistine by force. Just as chaos erupted, Glenn appeared. His face was unreadable as he pretended that his arrival was merely by chance. He turned to leave, but Sistine's desperate voice stopped him. She begged for help. Without hesitation, Glenn stepped forward. When the intruder attempted to cast a spell at him, something unexpected happened. The magic fizzled out completely. Glenn smirked and explained that he had already sealed off all magic within the area. The enemy panicked, believing Glenn to be an overwhelmingly powerful mage, but Glenn calmly added that he too was unable to use magic. Instead, he charged forward, relying solely on hand-to-hand combat. His punches and kicks landed with precision and power, sending the intruder sprawling across the floor. The students watched in awe as Glenn moved with the skill of a trained Imperial soldier, his technique refined and deadly. Panting, the man shouted, "Who are you?" Glenn replied coolly, "Just a substitute teacher." With one decisive kick, the intruder collapsed and was swiftly restrained. Glenn then turned to Sistine, asking if she was all right. She nodded, though her face was pale. She quickly explained that the intruders had discovered Rumia's true identity, causing Glenn's expression to darken. Examining the unconscious man's hand, Glenn noticed a strange mark, one that hinted at a hidden connection to something much larger. Elsewhere, a messenger arrived bearing news from the organization known as Divine Wisdom. He reported to Celica about the group's movements and the danger they posed. Upon hearing this, Glenn urged Celica to send reinforcements immediately, but Celica could only smile bitterly. She was merely a scholar, not a commander. Glenn insisted that the students' lives were at stake and demanded she use teleportation to reach the academy faster. However, Celica explained that the academy was protected by a powerful barrier, rendering teleportation magic useless. Even so, she promised to do everything she could, while Glenn for now would have to face the coming storm alone. When Sistine realized that reinforcements would never arrive, her heart blazed with determination to protect Rumia, no matter the cost. She tried to step forward, but Glenn stopped her sharply. His voice was firm, as he warned that if she acted recklessly, she would only lose her life in vain. His words struck deep, and Sistine's eyes filled with tears. Through trembling lips, she admitted he was right. Magic was indeed powerful for attack, yet she couldn't even protect her own friend. Glenn placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder and told her that Rumia understood magic better than anyone else. He swore to protect her, even if it meant facing two powerful enemies alone. The enemy mage laughed mockingly at Glenn's vow, calling him a murderer filled with evil intent. But Sistine shouted back with unwavering conviction that her teacher was no killer. Before anyone could react, a dark portal suddenly opened, and skeletal monsters crawled out from within. The enemy smirked, declaring that Divine Wisdom had sent reinforcements in the form of the undead. But to everyone's horror, one of the skeletons turned against him and instantly impaled its own master, throwing the battlefield into chaos. Glenn rushed forward to fight, only to realize that the creature's bones were as hard as steel. Sistine quickly cast a strengthening spell, reinforcing Glenn's arms with magical power that made his fists as unyielding as iron. With this newfound strength, Glenn shattered the skeletons one by one, crushing them into fragments. Afterwards, they tried to escape, but more skeletons emerged, relentlessly chasing them through the halls. As their chances of survival grew slim, Sistine refused to run any longer. She insisted on fighting beside her teacher. Glenn gave a small nod, accepting the bravery of his student, who now stood ready to face the darkness by his side. Amid the chaos, Glenn urged Sistine to unleash her magic. Though hesitant at first, she steeled herself, remembering that Rumia's safety and Glenn's trust depended on her. Summoning every last drop of willpower, Sistine cast her spell, holding back the advancing horde with shimmering waves of magic. But the strain was too much. Her power waned, and she gasped that she couldn't hold on any longer. Glenn gave her a faint, proud smile and praised her courage. Then he pulled out a strange glowing stone and began chanting. In an instant, a surge of dark mana erupted around him, followed by a massive explosion that obliterated every remaining skeleton. Sistine stood frozen in awe. Glenn had used a high-level spell, something far beyond what a so-called third-rate mage should have been capable of. But before she could question him, Glenn collapsed, his mana completely drained. Even so, he forced himself to stand, insisting that his duty wasn't over. Rumia still needed to be saved. Suddenly, another mage appeared. The aura around him was sharp and suffocating, revealing that he was a high-ranking sorcerer. Glenn immediately realized the danger. The stranger admitted he had underestimated Glenn, realizing that this substitute teacher was far stronger than expected. When Glenn ordered Sistine to stop the rain of magic swords falling from above, she could only lower her head in despair. Her mana was completely exhausted. Without hesitation, Glenn shoved Sistine off the building, ensuring her escape even as she stared at him in shock, unable to believe he would go that far. The battle raged on. Glenn faced the storm of blades with the last of his strength, deflecting and dodging as best he could, though many cuts tore through his flesh, staining the ground with blood. The enemy mage launched his ultimate attack, but Glenn countered with a secret magic card, forming a barrier that barely blocked the deadly strike. The enemy staggered in disbelief. He hadn't expected Glenn to possess such hidden power, but the barrage of magic swords continued, cutting deeper as Glenn's body weakened, blood dripping from his wounds while he stood his ground to protect the academy. In that critical moment, Sistine returned. Gathering the last of her remaining strength, she unleashed a final spell that weakened the barrage of magic swords, causing them to fall one after another. Glenn, his body battered and bleeding, seized one of the fallen blades with burning resolve. With a surge of willpower, he turned the enemy's own weapon against him. The magic sword flashed brilliantly as Glenn struck, driving the enemy mage back with a decisive blow. Before taking his final breath, the mage managed to whisper that this combat technique was once only used by mage hunters. Then, his body collapsed lifelessly to the ground. Sistine immediately understood Glenn's strategy. He had waited patiently for the perfect moment, striking only after the enemy had exhausted his power. After the battle, Glenn and Sistine rushed to find Rumia, but Glenn's condition grew worse. Panic filled Sistine's eyes as she tried to heal his wounds with magic. Barely conscious, Glenn weakly asked where the Academy's teleportation circle was located. Selka's voice echoed through the communication spell, explaining that it was hidden within a tall tower near the Academy grounds. Without hesitation, Glenn forced his weakened body to move and sprinted toward the tower. There, he finally found Rumia, but before he could reach her, another enemy mage appeared. Glenn glared at him coldly, accusing him of nothing but evil. The mage smirked and activated the magic circle beneath him, warning that if Glenn made a move, the entire area would explode. The ground below was lined with destructive runes. Rumia, terrified, pleaded with Glenn to run away, but he refused. The mage mocked him, saying he lacked the strength to kill him. Without flinching, Glenn sliced open his palm and began writing runes with his blood. Channeling his life force directly into the enemy's circle, he unleashed a forbidden art, blood magic. Layer by layer, he countered the destructive spell, even as his body trembled and his vision dimmed. Rumia screamed for him to stop, reminding him that such power could cost his life, but Glenn remained steadfast, declaring that he had no intention of living a meaningless existence. When he reached the final layer of the spell, Glenn collapsed. Seeing him fall, Rumia made a desperate choice. She reached into the collapsing magic field and shattered the barrier with her own hands, and used her healing magic to save him. Their combined willpower unraveled the last of the destructive runes and the explosion was halted. Glenn regained consciousness just in time to deliver one final punch, knocking the enemy mage unconscious. When Sistine finally arrived at the tower, she found Glenn lying on the floor, fast asleep from exhaustion. Moments later, Selka appeared and informed them that news had already spread across the kingdom, rumors that a royal descendant was attending their academy. However, only she and the headmaster knew Rumia's true secret. Selka gazed softly at Glenn and asked, "What made you change your mind and decide to stay here as a teacher?" Glenn turned to look at Sistine and Rumia, a curious smile on his face. He answered that he wanted to see how far they could go with magic, how much they could grow beyond the limits of their own fears. With that, Glenn returned to his classroom, ready to teach once more. Days later, inside the royal palace, the queen sat in her chamber as royal guard delivered his report. He assured the queen that the princess was safe. The rumors of her identity had begun to spread throughout the realm. For most, the princess was believed to have died long ago. The queen nodded silently and dismissed the guard, her eyes distant with sorrow. Softly, she murmured that it had been 3 years since she last saw Rumia, and perhaps by now her daughter had grown to resent her. Meanwhile, at the academy, Sistine and Rumia walked side by side toward their classroom. Once inside, they encouraged their fellow students to participate in the upcoming competition, but no one seemed interested. The atmosphere grew dull. Until Glenn entered. With his usual calm authority, he asked Sistine for the participant list, then began selecting capable students himself. His confidence reignited the class's spirit. He reminded them that each of them carried potential worth fighting for. Those not chosen simply weren't ready, yet. His words sparked determination across the room, and one by one, the students began to volunteer. Sistine and Rumia exchanged smiles of relief, proud to see their teacher once again inspiring everyone to rise.
When Glenn requested permission from the headmaster to make additional preparations for the competition, both Celica and the headmaster refused. Instead, the headmaster set a condition. If Glenn could ensure that every one of his students participated fully in the upcoming tournament, he would receive a special bonus. Hearing that, Glenn's face immediately lit up with excitement. Soon after, Sistine stood confidently before her classmates and boldly declared that she would be the one to win the competition, and that their opponent would be none other than Class 1. Her announcement made Glenn uneasy, realizing that her impulsive plan could easily jeopardize his carefully thought-out strategy. The following days were filled with intense training. The students gathered on the practice field, pushing themselves to their limits. However, tempers flared as rivalries between Class 1 and Class 2 erupted, filling the air with tension that felt like the calm before a storm. Just as the situation began to spiral out of control, Glenn arrived and immediately intervened, stopping the fight. Moments later, Professor Halley appeared, his presence commanding and stern. With a booming voice, he ordered Glenn to withdraw his students, claiming that victory in this year's competition would belong solely to his class. But Glenn stood his ground, confidently declaring that his students would also compete and fight for their place. Halley smirked mockingly, accusing Glenn of manipulating his students into joining. Then, with a sharp, challenging tone, he asked if Glenn truly believed he could win. Without hesitation, Glenn proposed a wager. The loser would surrender 3 months' worth of salary. Halley quickly deduced that Glenn must be short on money, but the determined look on his students' faces left him no choice but to accept. Despite his bold front, Glenn's confidence wavered. Deep down, he feared the bet might come back to haunt him if they lost. As his worries grew, Sistine stepped forward and faced Professor Halley directly. With unwavering resolve, she declared that her class would also train there, and that no one should dare look down on them, because this year's victory would be theirs. Hearing her bold statement, Glenn's anxiety only deepened. He felt that Sistine's fiery spirit might completely derail his plans. From that day on, Glenn and his students trained tirelessly, giving everything they had. Meanwhile, Rumya often drifted into memories of the past, of the mage who had once saved her life when she was on the brink of despair. Sistine noticed her quiet expression and gently asked what she was thinking. With eyes sparkling with enthusiasm, Rumya replied that she was simply excited for the upcoming competition, especially since the queen herself would be in attendance. That meant they had to give their absolute best. The next morning during breakfast, Sistine's parents delivered disappointing news. They wouldn't be able to attend the competition due to an urgent matter. Sistine and Rumya reluctantly accepted their absence, though their smiles dimmed with a hint of sadness. Meanwhile, far away, the queen was already on her way to the academy, holding a locket close to her heart, a small pendant containing a photo of herself and her beloved daughter. Finally, the long-awaited day arrived. The competition began. Cheers erupted through the air as students took their places on the grand arena. Magic spells lit up the sky like fireworks, and the atmosphere pulsed with energy. Glenn's class, once ridiculed and underestimated, stunned everyone with their extraordinary teamwork and skill. The battlefield transformed into a dazzling stage of courage, spirit, and magic, a moment that would forever be remembered in the Academy's history. As the tournament continued, Glenn's students grew even more determined. Their confidence burned like wildfire, fueled by the pride of how far they had come. Watching from the sidelines, Glenn couldn't help but smile, astonished by the strength and unity his class had built. Nearby, Celica watched the event unfold with a gleam of amusement in her eyes, as if savoring every second of the spectacle with quiet joy, knowing that this was only the beginning of a far greater story at the Magical Academy. The headmaster turned to Celica with a disapproving look, asking why she had spoken so casually in front of the queen. But before the atmosphere could grow tense, the queen herself smiled gently and said she took no offense. Celica simply replied with an easy laugh, "Her Majesty and I are old friends." The words left everyone speechless in awe. The competition continued with rising excitement. Glenn's team performed brilliantly, climbing up the ranks until they secured 3rd place overall. The next stage was the mental resistance trial, and this time Rumya stepped forward as their representative. Sistine, anxious and nervous, clenched her fists, but Glenn reassured her with quiet confidence. He believed in Rumya's extraordinary mental strength. As Rumya stood in the arena, her opponent, a young man beside her, asked softly why she was participating. With a gentle smile, Rumya answered, "Because my class believes in me. I can't let them down." The round began. The duelists cast their magic, striking directly at one another's minds, and anyone who faltered would be instantly eliminated. Rumya endured the first wave with grace, and round by round, one by one, her opponents fell until she and the young man remained. In the final bout, her opponent unleashed his most powerful spell, a devastating wave of psychic energy that tore into Rumya's consciousness, threatening to break her will. Her body trembled, her knees almost gave out. From the edge of the field, Glenn and Sistine called out to her, urging her to stop, saying she had done enough. But Rumya pleaded softly, asking for just a little more time. Glenn gazed at her with both worry and pride, his voice warm as he said, "You've already done your best. Don't push yourself too far."
And then something unexpected happened. As the crowd held its breath, Rumia's opponent suddenly collapsed mid-stance, his spell fading into nothing. For a moment, silence filled the arena, and then cheers exploded like thunder. Rumia had won. Her eyes shone with relief and pure happiness as Glenn's entire class erupted in celebration. From the royal box, the queen, who had been watching quietly, felt her heart swell. Seeing her daughter surrounded by true friends who stood by her side made her eyes glisten with emotion. Celica approached the queen and offered her assistance, but the queen shook her head gracefully, smiling with quiet confidence. She needed no help. Her daughter was safe and strong now. And so, another brilliant chapter of the magical tournament came to a close, a story not only of spells and power, but of friendship, courage, and unwavering trust. Elsewhere, within the shadowed corridors of the palace, a woman whispered to herself that she was the one who had abandoned Rumia long ago. Yet, as she watched the girl from afar, she felt her heart soften. She no longer wished to interfere with Rumia's life. At that very moment, two figures approached with calm but commanding steps. Albert and Riel, members of the Imperial Guard, whose very names carried the weight of authority. Back at the academy grounds, Glenn's class continued to soar through the ranks, their momentum unstoppable. But Glenn himself was starting to falter, his exhaustion catching up to him. From the distance, Albert and Riel spotted him immediately. Riel began to move forward, intent on confronting him, but Albert raised a hand to stop him. "Don't forget," he said gravely, "our mission takes priority. The Queen's life is in danger. Glenn can wait." Riel paused, his jaw tightening as the burden of their duty grew heavier. Meanwhile, Glenn, weak with hunger, stared longingly at his students enjoying their lunch. At that moment, Lynn approached with bright enthusiasm, telling him that she had been practicing tirelessly for the competition's magic performance showcase. Glenn smiled warmly and said, "Remember, this competition isn't just an exam, it's a festival. Enjoy it and choose magic that truly reflects your heart." To demonstrate, he used an illusion spell, transforming himself into a perfect likeness of Rumia. Lynn gasped in admiration at his flawless technique. After leaving the field, Sistine approached Rumia with a serious expression. The wind carried a faint tension between them, though it softened as Rumia later went to find Glenn. With her usual kindness, she handed him a small sandwich and smiled gently. Glenn's face lit up and he devoured it happily, feeling a spark of energy return. He asked playfully, "Did you make this, Rumia?" She shook her head with a soft laugh and replied honestly, "I'm not good at cooking. Someone made it for someone else, but somehow it ended up with you." Glenn blinked, puzzled yet amused, as a faint blush crossed Rumia's cheeks. In that fleeting moment, amidst the warmth of friendship and laughter, the burdens of battle seemed to fade, replaced by the quiet glow of connection that bound them all together. Without realizing it, the person Rumia referred to was Glenn himself, and the sandwich she handed him had actually been made by Sistine just for him, a small hidden secret wrapped within a simple moment, yet carrying deep meaning, like an invisible red thread of fate slowly weaving their hearts together. As the day faded into a tense orange-tinged dusk, the Queen approached Glenn with a grave expression. She told him that there was something important she needed to discuss, but Glenn, his gaze low, refused to meet her eyes and immediately declined. When he finally realized that the woman before him was none other than the Queen herself, his composure broke, shock flashing across his face. Nearby, Jills frowned, confused as to why the Queen had been allowed to come there at all. Glenn eventually spoke, his tone flat and weary, admitting that he was tired of his duties and intended to walk away from them entirely. The Queen then turned towards Rumia, trying to start a conversation, but with visible pain, she confessed that the person she had come to find had in truth died 3 years ago. Her words cut deep, Rumia's expression faltered, and with trembling lips she turned away, walking off in silence, her heart in turmoil. Watching her daughter leave, the Queen's chest tightened with sorrow. She knew Rumia likely despised her now. Shortly after the Queen departed, the Imperial Guards arrived promptly to escort her back to safety. From afar, Albert observed everything through his spiritual sight, while Riel, seething with frustration, prepared to give chase, but once again, Albert stopped him, his voice steady. "Don't forget, our mission matters more. The Queen's life is in danger. Glenn can wait." Reluctantly, Riel held back, the tension between duty and emotion gnawing at him. Meanwhile, Glenn turned to Sistine, his expression serious. He told her that he needed to find someone and asked her to stay behind and manage the students. Sistine nodded obediently, trusting her teacher completely, and Glenn set off into the fading light.
Elsewhere, Rumia sat alone beneath the dim glow of twilight, clutching a small locket tightly in her hands. Her whisper broke the silence. She already knew the truth. Tears traced her cheeks as she confessed to the empty air that she couldn't bring herself to forgive her mother for abandoning her. Yet deep down, she also understood. From the moment of her birth, Rumia had carried a curse, a dangerous debt that made her existence a threat to the kingdom. Because of that, an order had been issued for her death, but her mother, in a desperate act of love, had chosen to let her go so that she might live in secret. Since then, she had been raised by Sistine's parents, who had treated her as their own daughter. And now, Rumia feared that returning to her mother would only break the hearts of the family who had given her warmth and belonging. She felt trapped between two worlds, one of blood and one of love, and did not know which path to choose. It was then that Glenn appeared, his tone calm yet heavy with meaning. He told her that what made humans truly precious was their ability to feel regret after making choices. He admitted that he too had once been part of the Imperial Army, drowning in endless hollow missions. Yet he had never regretted leaving that life behind. He didn't want to live as a weapon, but as someone capable of making fair choices, someone who could find his own purpose. He explained that when he left the military, he knew that his future would rest entirely in his own hands. Then, looking at Rumia with steady eyes, he said, "Only you can decide where your next step leads." Rumia listened quietly, the weight of his words sinking deep into her heart. But before the peace could settle, several Imperial guards suddenly appeared from the shadows. Glenn immediately confronted them, demanding proof that their orders truly came from the royal family. The guards coldly presented their insignia, confirming that the command was genuine. Rumia's eyes widened with dread as Glenn moved to protect her. She shook her head in resignation, ready to surrender herself. Glenn refused to stand aside, but before he could act, the guard struck with ruthless precision. Blows rained down on him until his body collapsed to the ground unconscious. Rumia's trembling voice called his name, but he did not stir. The sound of armored boots echoed through the fading night, carrying both her grief and the shadow of the fate she could no longer escape. Rumia was nearly taken away for execution when Glenn, driven by fierce determination, rose to his feet and swiftly subdued all the guards. He seized Rumia's hand, and the girl, her eyes wide with disbelief, wondered why he would risk everything just to save her. With a firm voice, Glenn explained that it was Sistine who had sent him, deeply worried for her friend's safety. Before they could even catch their breath, another group of guards appeared, forcing Glenn to lift Rumia into his arms and flee through the crowded city streets. In the chaos, he tried to contact Celica for help, but she coldly refused, shocking him. Suspicion began to stir in Glenn's mind. He realized this entire commotion might be one of Gielos's cunning schemes, manipulating the guards from behind the scenes. While doubt clouded his thoughts, two powerful figures, Albert and Riel, suddenly appeared and attacked him without hesitation. The ambush cornered Glenn, but elsewhere, Celica overheard Matt's grim words. As long as the queen was present, no one could save Rumia except Glenn himself. The battle erupted fiercely. Riel swung her enchanted blade, but Glenn dodged with agility and shattered her weapon. Riel quickly forged another sword with magic, yet Glenn countered with sharp ice magic that clashed against her newly formed blade. Just as Riel was about to strike him down, Albert suddenly turned on her, knocking her to the ground. The tension grew thick with confusion. Albert approached Glenn with a faint smile, remarking that it had been a long time since they last met. Glenn, both startled and relieved, recognized him immediately. Rumia, still bewildered, looked at Glenn with curiosity, wondering who this man truly was. Glenn clarified that Albert and Riel were not strangers, but his former comrades, who once served alongside him in the Imperial Army. Back then, Glenn had been punishing Riel for her disobedience, while Albert explained that their mission now was to protect the queen. Meanwhile, Gielos and the Imperial Guards had already captured the queen and planned to eliminate Rumia. Riel stubbornly suggested that the three of them join forces to attack, but Glenn disapproved of her reckless idea. He reminded them that Celica was with the queen, but couldn't possibly handle everything alone. Therefore, Glenn requested Albert's help, and Albert agreed to stand by his side. At the same time, Sistine and the students anxiously awaited Glenn's arrival. Suddenly, Albert appeared, informing them that Glenn couldn't come due to an urgent matter, and that he would take command instead. Sistine accepted calmly, but the others protested. With a determined voice, Sistine told them that if they lost, Glenn would mock and belittle them without mercy. Her fiery words reignited their spirits, anger turned to resolve, and the students vowed to win the competition. The magical illusion continued, and the next turn belonged to Philin. Brimming with confidence, she approached Albert, assuring him she could win the round. Philin then summoned a celestial being through her spell, creating a magnificent illusion that secured her victory. The performance of Class 2 began to shine brighter, gradually closing the gap with Class 1. Meanwhile, Glenn kept running, dodging the relentless guards pursuing Rumia.
News reached Gealos that his soldiers had failed to capture her. His fury erupted, and he ordered Rumia to be seized and executed at once. At the same time, the fierce competition between Class 1 and Class 2 reached its climax. 16 students from Class 2 recalled their endless efforts and unleashed every ounce of strength to claim victory.
But before long, Glenn and Rumia were surrounded by guards. Simultaneously, the competition ended with a stunning twist. Albert and Real revealed their true forms. The truth emerged. Glenn and Rumia had been there all along. Through Albert's clever illusion magic, the guards were deceived and driven away, turning the battlefield into a vibrant victory beyond anyone's expectations. Amid the chaos, Gealos could no longer contain his rage. He shouted furiously, commanding all guards to attack. But Celica raised her hand, summoning radiant light to form a massive barrier that separated everyone. In that moment, Glenn approached the queen and revealed the truth he had discovered. Gealos bowed deeply, his face filled with remorse. He admitted that the queen had sacrificed so much and declared that he was ready to face any punishment for his mistakes. However, before accepting any judgment, he asked that the next command come from the queen herself. The air grew heavy with tension when the queen suddenly gave a shocking order. Rumia was to be eliminated. Everyone, including Glenn, froze in disbelief. Glenn cried out that the queen was lying, but Rumia quietly accepted her fate, seeing it as atonement for her sins. As Gealos stepped towards Rumia to deliver the final blow, a flash of memory struck Glenn's mind, memories of how dearly the queen had loved her daughter. His eyes fell upon the necklace hanging from the queen's neck. He questioned her about it, and she gently replied that it was one of her most treasured possessions. In that instant, Glenn darted forward with determination. Gealos' sword narrowly missed him, but it was too late. The necklace had already been ripped from the queen's neck. The trinket shattered, unleashing a surge of dark, cursed energy that filled the room with suffocating pressure. Glenn then revealed the truth. The queen had been under the control of that cursed power all along. Gealos, stunned, demanded to know how Glenn could understand his magic. Glenn gave a faint smile, pulling out a sealing talisman, and calmly answered that he had already neutralized the curse from the start. He then turned to the queen with a gentle gaze and told her that her daughter was safe, urging her to speak her true feelings to Rumia. Tears streamed down the queen's face as she embraced her daughter tightly. The two wept in relief and joy, and with that heartfelt reunion, the magical barrier finally crumbled. Meanwhile, Albert and Real chased down a servant who had been involved in the incident, but the traitor managed to escape using teleportation magic. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Glenn reunited with Albert and Real to thank them sincerely for their help. Real smiled, saying that someday they would surely fight together again on another mission. Celica then accompanied the queen back to the royal palace. Elsewhere, Rumia walked alongside Glenn, softly asking how he knew that her mother had been lying. Glenn reminded her that 3 years ago, when she had been kidnapped, it was the queen herself who had begged him to protect her daughter. From that moment, he had understood how deeply the queen loved Rumia. Later that evening, the two went to a restaurant that Class 1 was celebrating their victory in the competition. But what they found left them stunned. The students were completely drunk with joy, reveling without restraint. Sistine, clearly tipsy, stumbled over to Glenn with a wide grin and asked if they had truly won. Glenn said nothing, his eyes fixed on the massive bill laid out on the table. His face darkened as he realized that all the prize money and betting profits he had earned were gone, spent entirely on the students' lavish feast. In the days that followed, the mood shifted. Sistine began training intensively under Glenn's supervision, enduring grueling physical exercises. Glenn emphasized that a strong body sharpens the senses and prepares the mind. Only then could she learn military-grade magic with a single purpose: to protect Rumia. Sistine nodded resolutely, accepting her path with determination. Later, Glenn waited for Rumia and Sistine to arrive. When they appeared, the three began walking together toward the academy. But suddenly, a swift strike came from behind. Real attacked Glenn without warning. He blocked her blow just in time and asked irritably why she kept attacking him. Real replied curtly that it was her way of training herself. Glenn sighed and told her to find another method. Sistine and Rumia were startled to see Real wearing the academy uniform. It turned out that Real had been assigned by the military as a disguised student. Her true mission was to protect Rumia. Glenn had no idea about this arrangement.
Still, Real firmly declared that she was there to protect Glenn as well. Frustrated, Glenn lifted her chin and sternly reminded her that her duty was to guard Rumia, and she should never forget it. Finally, they arrived at the academy. The students were immediately captivated by Real's appearance. With her innocent face and graceful charm, she quickly became the center of attention, leaving everyone in awe. The classroom buzzed with curious whispers. Real, her calm eyes carrying a quiet depth, finally revealed her real name to everyone, but Glenn quickly interrupted her in a firm tone, warning her to stay silent. He reminded her that she was here as a student, not a soldier. Real nodded in obedience, though her heart remained resolute. Deep down, she had already decided that one day she would join the Imperial Army. When one of the girls curiously asked about her family, Real responded softly, but with a tone that cut through the air. She said she only had an older brother, and now she had no family left in this world. The entire class fell silent, and the girl who had asked quickly apologized. But the tension rose again when another student blurted out a bolder question, asking what her relationship with Glenn was. Without hesitation, Real smiled faintly and confessed that she liked him. The classroom erupted into chaos. Everyone stared in shock, the atmosphere thick with disbelief and excitement. Not long after, everyone gathered in the training field for a magic exercise. Sistine stepped forward first, channeling her spell with immense power that obliterated the practice dummy. Glenn watched in awe, complimenting her for her growing strength. Then it was Real's turn. The students murmured among themselves, full of expectation, remembering her ambition to become part of the Imperial Army. However, when Real unleashed her lightning spell, it completely missed the target. Disappointment spread as students began to assume her magic might actually be weak. Glenn approached her calmly and asked whether she truly couldn't hit the target. Real lowered her gaze, then quietly asked if destroying the target was all that mattered. When Glenn nodded, Real's eyes sharpened with determination. She began chanting a deeper incantation, and in an instant, a blade of lightning materialized in her hand. With one swift motion, she struck, shattering the training dummy. The students gasped, stunned by the overwhelming power that Real had concealed beneath her calm demeanor. From that day on, many students kept their distance, intimidated by her strength. Yet Sistine and Rumia still approached her with warm smiles, inviting her to lunch in the academy cafeteria. While they enjoyed their meal, some other students gathered around, eager to learn the secret behind Real's magic. But Real stayed quiet, keeping her mystery to herself. Meanwhile, Glenn made his way to the library to meet Celica. He understood that what his students needed most was not just power, but the ability to appreciate the process of growth itself. The next day brought a new round of lessons and surprises. The students weren't thrilled when they learned they would be involved in a research project, so Glenn decided to lift their spirits. With a mischievous grin, he told them that the research facility was located on an island with a beautiful beach filled with sunshine, fun, and laughter. The mention of the beach and the thought of seeing many beautiful girls there instantly reignited their enthusiasm. Later, some of the girls stopped by a toy shop to buy trinkets, but Glenn reminded them not to linger too long. The shopkeeper suddenly gave Glenn a piercing look and remarked that he must have come there not as a teacher, but as a watcher. He exposed the truth, that Real was merely a decoy, and Glenn was the real guardian assigned to protect Rumia. The revelation caught Glenn off guard for only a moment before he calmly admitted it, saying that both he and the shopkeeper knew Real's true role. The shopkeeper then dropped his disguise. It was Albert, once again undercover. He warned Glenn to stay cautious before departing quietly. Soon after, Glenn led his students toward the beach. He had purposely chosen this route to let them see the breathtaking blue sea under the sunlight. When they finally arrived, the students ran gleefully across the white sand, playing volleyball, laughing and splashing in the water. Even the assistants joined in, and for that day, the weight of academic life vanished in the ocean breeze. As night fell, they returned to the hotel. The male students secretly plotted a mischievous plan to sneak into the girls' rooms, but Glenn caught them. With his usual cool expression, he told them that if he were in their position, he would choose another path. The boys instantly dropped their scheme, laughter replacing their embarrassment as they returned to their rooms. On the other side, Real began to change. She laughed more, played freely, and started blending in with her classmates. Seeing her transformation, Rumia and Sistine smiled in relief. The once rigid and distant girl was finally opening her heart. Meanwhile, Glenn stood alone by the shore, gazing at the stars shimmering over the night sky. Moments later, Rumia, Sistine, and Real joined him. Together, they sat in silence for a while, staring up at the glittering sky. Then, without another word, they ran into the waves, laughing under the moonlight. Watching the three girls laugh under the moonlight, Glenn felt a warmth bloom in his chest. That night, he realized how beautiful life could be when lived like an ordinary student. With a gentle smile, he whispered softly, that Riel too could live as a student, free to enjoy her days just like the others. But those simple words struck deeply within someone's heart. Riel's eyes flared with emotion, her anger bursting forth. She shouted that protecting someone was not a sin, that Glenn had changed because of Sistine and Rumia's influence. Her voice trembled with pain as she admitted she despised the two girls, then ran off into the night, leaving behind a heavy silence. Glenn stood frozen, guilt welling up inside him. He regretted the careless words that had wounded her so deeply. The next morning, the group prepared to head toward the research facility. Riel walked quietly, her expression clouded with sadness. Meanwhile, Sistine and Rumia chatted cheerfully, unaware of the emotional storm inside Riel. Then, suddenly, Riel tripped over a tree root and fell to the ground. Without hesitation, Sistine and Rumia rushed to help her, but Riel refused sharply, her face marked with emotional scars. She told them coldly that she didn't like them and asked them to stay away. Everyone who heard her was stunned. Even Rumia began to wonder if Riel truly hated them. In the midst of that tension, Glenn arrived and took responsibility. He admitted that everything was his fault, that he had said things he never should have. Yet, he vowed that one day he would make things right and mend Riel's heart. The journey continued in uneasy silence. Eventually, the students reached the magnificent research center. The head of the facility greeted them warmly. While the students, exhausted from the long trip, tried to stay alert, Sistine couldn't hide her worry for Riel. They entered a towering building filled with strange, magical energy. The director explained that the facility was a fusion of magic and alchemy, built to develop new forms of sorcery and study peculiar creatures. Rumia looked around with unease. Her heart trembled as she saw the hybrid beings confined in glass chambers. To her, the experiments felt cruel, unfair to both humans and animals. Sistine agreed, but added that such research could also be used to eradicate evil organizations. She then told Rumia about Project Revel, a massive study that originated from this very research lab. Its goal? To bring the dead back to life. Just then, the director approached, impressed by Sistine's vast knowledge. He looked at her as if she were a star shining brighter than the rest of the students. Inside the mysterious laboratory, the group listened closely as Glenn explained the shocking details of Project Revival. He stated that the resurrection process required 3 core elements: the energetic code to create a body, the hustle code to transfer memories into it, and the filter to embed the soul. Once all 3 processes were completed, the revival would be achieved. The assistant president looked amazed, but her tone soon turned cold. She reminded everyone that the experiment had failed because of Glenn's past mistakes. Glenn bowed deeply, apologizing without hesitation. Meanwhile, Rumia turned to the headmaster with curiosity, asking if the process could be repeated. The headmaster explained that the technique was merely a form of duplication, a transfer of consciousness into an artificial genetic body. Jillian added that the research had long been discontinued for a tragic reason. To bring back one life, countless others had to be sacrificed. The headmaster nodded in agreement, emphasizing that humans were not gods. They had no right to decide who lived or died, which is why the dangerous research had been banned. However, there was grim news. The Wisdom Organization had already uncovered the formula. There was a real possibility they would attempt to resurrect the project. Sistine was now deeply intrigued, asking what else was needed besides the 3 core elements. The headmaster replied that after the 3 were combined, one more requirement remained: original magic, a form of pure mana so immense it was nearly impossible for ordinary humans to wield. Sistine fell silent, realizing how cataclysmic that power could be. By the time the sun began to set, the group returned to their hotel. Sistine approached Riel and invited her to dinner, but Riel declined, her face still clouded with sadness. Glenn arrived shortly after and gently reminded Riel not to harden her heart so much. Instead of calming down, she ran away with tears in her eyes. Glenn sighed softly and told Sistine and Rumia that Riel was more fragile than she appeared. She had no one left in the world. Loneliness had shaped her pain, and that pain is what made her so human. Sistine and Rumia firmly told Glenn that they had never hated Riel. Still, Sistine couldn't hide her worry and insisted on going to look for her. Glenn stopped her, his tone calm yet commanding. He said that Riel was his student and it was his responsibility to find her. He ordered them to return to their rooms and wait. Once he finished speaking, Glenn set off into the night to find Riel. Meanwhile, by the quiet shore, Riel wept bitterly as her tears blended with the crashing waves. Then a familiar figure appeared before her brother. He stepped closer and whispered with urgency that she had to help him complete their mission, and to do that they needed Rumia. He demanded that she bring Rumia to him. His words pierced Riel's heart.
filling her with doubt. Should she betray Glenn and everyone who had trusted her? Elsewhere, Albert sensed that something was wrong. He realized that Riel's brother wasn't real. He was an illusion born of dark magic. Realizing the deception, Albert rushed off, only to be stopped by Eleonora. She demanded to know how he had discovered her secret. Their confrontation exploded into a fierce battle, magic clashing in violent bursts that set the forest ablaze. Eleonora summoned hordes of undead to attack, but Albert countered with a storm of lightning that obliterated them all. Though wounded, Eleonora healed herself effortlessly and smirked. "Now, this fight will be much more entertaining," she taunted. Albert could only brace himself, sensing how dangerous she truly was. Back at the hotel, Sistine and Romia were consumed with worry. They couldn't stop thinking about Riel. In a small attempt to lift her spirits, Sistine murmured that Riel always loved to eat. Perhaps food might calm her down. With that thought, she decided to go out shopping for something to bring back. At that same time, Glenn finally found Riel. His voice was sharp as he declared that the man she had seen was not her real brother. Riel's eyes widened in shock, but before he could say another word, her sword flashed. With tears streaming down her face, she screamed that she had to help her brother. Her blade struck Glenn, and he fell to the ground, blood pouring from his body. The terrible news quickly reached Albert, and his face filled with dread. Sensing the danger, Eleanor fled the scene. Meanwhile, Sistine returned from her errand, only to be met with a horrifying sight. Rumia lay unconscious on the floor. Riel stood nearby, her expression trembling between anger and sorrow. She assured Sistine that Rumia was still alive, but what she said next shattered Sistine's world. Riel confessed that she had killed Glenn. Sistine froze, her breath caught in her throat, her eyes wide in disbelief. With a trembling voice, she asked why Riel had done it. Riel's answer was cold and unhesitating. She had done it for the evil organization she served. Furious, Sistine prepared to fight, but Riel stood calmly and said she wouldn't resist. Seeing Riel's expression and remembering Romeo lying nearby, Sistine hesitated. Her courage faltered. Fear gripped her heart. She realized she was more afraid of causing harm than driven by anger. In that moment of weakness, Riel took Rumia and disappeared into the night, leaving Sistine behind, trembling with frustration and guilt. Suddenly, the door burst open. Albert entered carrying Glenn's bloodied body. Sistine's face went pale at the sight of her wounded teacher. Albert explained urgently that Glenn was still alive but had very little time left. Panicking, Sistine asked if healing magic could save him, but Albert shook his head grimly. Too much blood had been lost, and healing magic would not be enough. Tears streamed down Sistine's face as despair threatened to consume her, but Albert refused to give up. With unwavering resolve, he told her there was one last way, a forbidden ancient ritual that could revive Glenn, but it required immense mana. He needed her help. Sistine hesitated, her mind spinning in fear and confusion, but Albert's steady voice cut through the chaos. Everything depended on her choice. With trembling hands, Sistine finally nodded. Then Glenn's breathing stopped. Albert shouted for Sistine to perform CPR while he prepared the ritual. He slashed his palm with a blade, letting his blood drip into the soil as he began chanting. A crimson glow erupted from the ritual circle, painting the room in a sinister light. Life and death clashed within their magic, their desperate struggle to reclaim Glenn's fading soul. While the assistant worked frantically to keep Glenn alive, elsewhere Rumia regained consciousness in the laboratory. There, Riel's brother, or the thing pretending to be him, watched her coldly and declared that their mission was nearly complete. Confused and afraid, Rumia demanded to know what had happened to Glenn. The false brother's reply made her blood run cold. The shocking revelation silenced her completely, leaving only a trembling voice asking for the truth. Riel's answer was hollow, her eyes distant. She said that her true purpose in life was still unknown. Albert approached Glenn, reminding him to thank Sistine. It was her immense mana that had saved his life. Even Albert himself was impressed by the sheer amount of magical energy the girl possessed, far greater than he had expected. Glenn expressed his sincere gratitude, but Albert reprimanded him gently, saying that he had warned him about the dangers of overextending himself. Glenn hadn't listened. Now he was paying the price. Glenn then asked whether the Dark Organization already knew about their plan. Albert's expression hardened as he confirmed that the Imperial Army had sent word. Everything had been a trap. The kidnappings, the chaos, it had all been orchestrated to set the stage for a secret project. Without wasting a moment, Glenn and Albert set off to rescue Rumia. At the same time, Sistine, who had been unconscious after the mana-draining ritual, finally stirred awake. Meanwhile, at the research facility, the headmaster was working alongside Riel's brother to activate the Resurrection Project. That was why they needed Rumia. Her power was the final key to completing their dark experiment. Now that she was in their hands, the ritual was about to begin. But their scheme would not go unchallenged. Albert had secretly placed a tracking spell on Eleanor, allowing them to trace her exact location. When the two men arrived, the headmaster greeted them with a mocking smile and a deadly threat. He promised to destroy them using one of his monstrous creations. Moments later, a terrifying lion-like beast emerged, its roars shaking the ground. Yet Albert remained calm. With a single strike of his lightning magic, he obliterated the creature completely. Eleanor gasped in disbelief. She had underestimated them.
Elsewhere, the girls from Sistine's class gathered around, panicking as they discussed Rumia's condition, Real's betrayal, and Sistine's absence. But danger was still far from over. Another monstrous being, far larger and more powerful than before, rose from the depths of the facility. The earth trembled as its massive limbs crashed against the ground. Albert held his ground, meeting the creature's blow with pure magical force. Glenn then unleashed a devastating counterattack, engulfing the monster in a burst of searing energy. When the light faded, the beast lay motionless. The headmaster's fury boiled over. His voice echoed through the chamber as he shouted that he would no longer rely on his creations. "If you've destroyed my work," he roared, "then I'll deal with you myself." His body began to twist and warp, mutating into a grotesque abomination before everyone's eyes. The students watching from afar froze in horror. Albert turned to Glenn with a firm gaze and said, "You must go. Leave this monster to me." Without hesitation, Glenn nodded and sprinted off toward Rumia's location. Behind him, the sounds of battle shook the air as Albert faced the monstrous headmaster. Meanwhile, the students began arguing among themselves. "Why did Glenn just run off without telling us anything?" one of them complained. Another replied coldly, "If he wants to fight alone, then let him. We don't need to get involved." But Sistine stepped forward, her expression fierce and resolute. "That's not what he meant. He trusts us, that's why he left without saying anything. If we follow him recklessly, we'll only slow him down." Her words struck deeply. The students fell silent, their frustration giving way to faith. One by one, they agreed to place their trust entirely in Glenn. Elsewhere, Glenn finally reached the chamber where Rumia was held. She looked up in shock as he appeared, his face worn yet determined. He gave her a small, weary smile and apologized for being late. Then his eyes hardened as he stepped toward Real's brother. But before he could reach them, Real appeared between them, her eyes blazing with fury. "Don't you dare come near my brother," she screamed, summoning her magical blade from the air, its glow sharp and deadly in the dim light. Real refused to accept the truth that the person she believed to be her brother was nothing but an illusion. Consumed by anger and confusion, she attacked Glenn relentlessly, her blade clashing against the waves of magic that filled the air. From a distance, Rumia watched in fear, desperately trying to stop her, but Real could no longer hear anything. Caught between pain and despair, she continued her furious assault until Glenn was thrown to the ground, blood tracing the corner of his lips. Cornered and wounded, Glenn struggled to fight back. He fired a volley of magic bullets, but Real dodged them effortlessly, her movements sharp and fluid, her power overwhelming. Realizing brute force would not save her, Glenn tried to awaken the truth buried deep within her mind. His attempt only brought her agony. Her head throbbed violently, as if something inside her resisted the memories struggling to surface. As she collapsed to the ground, the cold voice of her so-called brother echoed through the air, commanding her to destroy Glenn completely. But Glenn refused to give in. With unshakable resolve, he destroyed the machine imprisoning Rumia, shattering the cursed bindings that held her captive. In the chaos of the battle, he struck Real with all his strength, forcing her to face the falsehood that had shaped her existence. Suddenly, the shadows of the past emerged. The name Real was not her true name. It was a creation born from a forbidden experiment known as Project Revivaler. Years ago, a scientist named San had attempted to create a replica of his younger sister Sile. Guilt eventually consumed him, and he decided to end the project. That decision cost him his life. His own friend Reiner betrayed him and plunged a dagger into his back. Soon after, their colleague Alicia became the next victim. Before dying, San had entrusted the dark secret of the project to Glenn, who at that time served as a mage in the Imperial Army. When Glenn arrived at the research site, he found only Sile's lifeless body. From that day forward, he swore to protect the clone, Real, no matter the cost. Time returned to the present. The The man pretending to be Real's brother was none other than Reiner, the traitor who had murdered Zan. When Glenn tried to attack him, dozens of thin Real clones appeared to block his way. In the chaos, one of the clones lunged toward the Real. Without hesitation, Glenn leapt forward and shielded her with his own body. The blow struck him directly, leaving Real frozen in shock as she realized that the very man she had fought against was the one who had just saved her life. Real could no longer understand why Glenn still chose to protect her after all she had done. Yet when their eyes met, Glenn's gaze was calm and sincere. He never saw her as a clone, but as someone precious. Those unspoken words reignited something deep within her, a spark of courage and acceptance. Lifting her weapon high, Real released a surge of light that tore through the air, erasing every remaining clone in front of them. While she faced her past, Glenn stepped forward to confront Reiner. The traitor unleashed his magic, but Glenn swiftly sealed the spell before it could even form. Standing firm, he aimed his pistol at Reiner's head, causing his face to turn pale with fear. Yet the weapon was empty, merely a distraction. In the next instant, Glenn's fist struck hard across Reiner's jaw, sending him crashing to the ground.